We didn't grow up knowing what executive function skills were. Life felt overwhelming. Managing time, staying organized, and feeling stuck made everything difficult. What we didn't realize was that we lacked the skills to plan, prioritize, and break goals into manageable steps. After years of trial and error, we've seen how powerful executive function skills can be. With expert interviews, real stories, and practical strategies, this podcast is the resource we wish we had. Whether you're a student, parent, or professional, we're here to help you unlock your potential. Welcome to the Executive Function for All podcast. Today we're joined by neuropsychologist Zach Sussman to discuss one of the most universal struggles, procrastination. In this episode, Zach breaks down what's happening in the brain when we can't get started, particularly for individuals with ADHD or other executive function challenges. He shares how to identify the root cause of task initiation struggles and provides strategies to break this frustrating cycle. I learned a lot during this conversation and developed more empathy for myself and others around procrastination. Zach, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I want to talk to you about procrastination. This word comes up so many times now. It feels like when I was a teacher, most of my job was helping kids with work. And now it feels like most of my job is getting people to start. So what is going on with the brain when we procrastinate?
First of all, I think procrastination is a pretty complex topic. It's not the same thing for every person. But if you really want to get into the brain, think about the mechanisms related to it. There's kind of two large structural areas to talk about. The first one is the limbic system. And the limbic system is this pre-mammalian brain. Think about this as the original brain that formed in mammals. It's what relates to our basic drives. So you're hungry, you've got to eat. It helps you drive to satisfy that need. You're afraid of a predator, you run away. Rewards you, helps that drive to get away from the predator. And then as humans have evolved, and really this part of the brain is only in humans, but the prefrontal cortex is the other piece that we're talking about. That is very important for long-term planning, long-term goals. It's really when you think about executive functions, that's the part of the brain that's all about the executive functions. So procrastination is a battle in the mind between these two parts. And what it relates to is we have basic drives to avoid something that's causing us anxiety, like a big project that's coming up, or basic drives like I would really like to go on a screen, play this video game, text my friend. And then that's competing with the part of our brain that's trying to stop us and to try to think about the longer term project that we're working towards. So procrastination is when that limbic system part, the basic part with basic needs, is winning out. And unfortunately, it's pretty strong. So for a lot of people, it takes a lot of conscious effort and a lot of work to build up your prefrontal cortex.
I love how you describe that. I've never heard the battle in the brain type piece. And so I have so many follow-up questions about that. But my first one is, do you talk to a lot of people who associate procrastination with their character versus this battle in the brain thing you're describing?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a ton of shame and guilt around procrastination. So I think one thing that happens is, first of all, everyone procrastinates. It's just a part of being a human. Sometimes you are not going to win out in that battle. And unfortunately, it can be a reinforcing loop. The more you procrastinate, the more vulnerable you are too. We even know that from neural pathway development. So I think from a character side, there are people that say, I am a procrastinator. That is who I am. But fundamentally, I think it's important to understand that this process that's going on in the brain is plastic. It is something that we can absolutely learn skills with. And it's things that when we have more insight into the way that we think, you can have different strategies that are going to make a pretty big difference functionally.
Yeah. So what about people with ADHD? Because I hear over and over people with ADHD talk about the core issue is the procrastination.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
That's a good question. I mean, when it comes down to it, procrastination is an executive function issue. That's what it is. For ADHD, the area of the brain that you talk about the most is the prefrontal cortex. So when you think about that battle going on in the mind, the area that's helping inhibit and stop them from engaging in procrastination, that's helping them break down larger tasks, it's an area of the brain that functions differently than it does for a lot of other people. So, we can talk about specific mechanisms like the DRD2 gene. So there's been a lot of evidence that shows that the way in which dopamine, our main drive neurotransmitter, the chemical in the brain that makes us do things and drive to motivate and pursue actions, That's different for folks with ADHD on a genetic level. And so if you think about them having less dopamine in the prefrontal cortex and less of an ability to inhibit themselves, they are far more vulnerable to engage in those patterns of behavior, the ways in which they're distracted by their screens, the way in which they're not breaking down the task as much in the future. As a neuropsychologist, I like to think about this more so from the function than the anatomy. And when I think about the function of the prefrontal cortex, really what we're talking about is metacognition and inhibitory control. So metacognition is that ability to plan and organize. Inhibitory control is your ability to stop yourself. And those are the two big areas that I think are big growth domains for folks with ADHD.
Yeah, well said. I love how you, again, didn't circle it back to character.
Yeah.
Because the amount of families, I'm sure you have to hear this in your office, where we get right into character issues. About procrastination, knowing it's just a neurological difference. Now, it's not good or bad. It is what it is. We have to implement some strategies. But just knowing that, that's comforting to me as someone with ADHD, knowing that I didn't mess this up.
Absolutely. I think there's some really sad misconceptions around ADHD and procrastination that lead to some really challenging judgments. The number one that I hear all the time is procrastination is laziness, which is so sad to hear because I see so many folks that have tons of motivation to get their work done and a lot of shame and guilt around the challenges they have in advanced planning and thinking out ahead. So for them to then be stuck with labels about how they're someone who is willfully not doing it, right? Or there's a problem with their personality can lead to a lot more significant psychological issues.
What are other misconceptions that you commonly hear?
Yeah, I think a lot of the misconceptions that I hear most often are related to the ways in which to address procrastination. I think one that a lot of parents try to use early on is let's have a big long-term reward. Yeah. At the end of the semester, you get a Nintendo if you have, 2 missing assignments for the whole semester. And the challenge with that is folks with ADHD have different perceptions of time than folks without. So if you're thinking about a way to address procrastination, it really does need to focus on the immediate, on the moment, in setting up a context for how they're working. So the idea that you could reward them by thinking 6 months down the road is unfortunately very unlikely to modify the behavior or make a significant change. Similarly, I think immediate punishments are a big issue with this.
Thank you for saying that, because this is like my number one piece of coaching for families. It's like, school feels so artificial.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I do well on this assignment and I accumulate those assignments, I'll get a grade, and all these grades get me somewhere in the future. Mm-hmm. And as someone with ADHD, I'm much more in the moment. And so trying to say, okay, if I don't procrastinate now, I'll get the reward 6 months from now. That just never worked for me.
Right.
Is that common?
Yeah, absolutely. It's common. I mean, that approach is really well-intentioned. It just doesn't have that same effect. I mean, the sad part for me with the punishment models is you have someone who is a soccer player who has a big part of their identity is that athlete. And they have a lot of opportunities for movement, which increases the dopamine flow in your brain and allows you to be better at initiating and getting tasks done. And it also creates a natural pattern of breaks to their workflow. And then a punishment might be you can't do soccer for a week if you don't get this assignment started in a reasonable time. So now you've really not only not changed or modified the behavior, but you've impacted it negatively in a different way.
Yeah, I want to dive in deep to that change and modification of behavior in a second. But before then, I've heard procrastination talked about in a couple of ways. One is a behavioral way. Like we don't do what we need to do and it's a behavioral thing. Others an emotional way. Like we're overwhelmed by whatever the task is, so we don't want to start it because it's too overwhelming. How do you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're bringing up the concept of the relationship between anxiety and procrastination. And, we can talk about the brain-based side of it, the fact that procrastination leads to elevated rates of cortisol. So then you have more stress and more anxiety around starting. But I think the concept that you're talking about, to me, most relates to the learned behavior around procrastination. The way in which you procrastinate and you develop a system or flow to how you approach tasks. And then the next time you have that project, you have your anxiety already elevated a little bit because you're thinking about that cortisol experience that you had, the stress you had when you couldn't get it done. And unfortunately, that makes it harder to initiate. So then the third time, you have an even higher level. And it creates a really challenging spiral going down there.
Yeah, and when we get really highly anxious, when we get to fight or flight, when that cortisol is flowing, basically your frontal lobe turns off, right? Like your executive function skills just don't
very
really
inhibited.
Work. Yeah. What about the people who say I need a high level of anxiety just to get started?
Yeah.
What is that all about?
There's a great study looking at college students who talked about that exact idea, saying, I need the pressure. I can't get this done until we look at my pressure. And the study was looking at their stress level and performance level throughout a semester. And sure enough, the folks that said, I need that elevated stress to perform, had a lower stress level at the start of the year relative to their peers that were just starting on projects and breaking things down. But then if you looked at their overall stress levels throughout the year, they went way through the roof compared to their peers, and they got lower grades, and they talked about a lot of regret for their approach. I think there's a big misnomer about this idea of, I need to experience a certain amount of pressure or stress to achieve. With that said, I think there's another important element, which is that time dilation component with ADHD, where people have a different perspective with ADHD on the time ahead of them. So I do think it's important to respect the idea that someone with ADHD might not be thinking as far out as we would anticipate they would. You can see differences from elementary, middle school, college and young adulthood as far as thinking less far out than similar peers that don't have ADHD. So part of that pressure concept should be respected, that it's harder for them to think that far out. I just think it's an unfortunate pattern if you focus too much on elevating your stress to achieve.
You're the first person I've ever talked to when we talk about procrastination, talk about time dilation. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's a big deal here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like I know a lot of us don't necessarily have a normal relationship with time, and I don't even know what normal means. But
what is normal? Right?
I know that I'm like hyper focused on something, or I am not interested in it at all, and
that split.
It's really hard. So another thing I've heard is that with dopamine levels, if let's say you have an ADHD child, if they're interested in it, they're going to get deep into it. But if they're not interested in it, it's like twice as hard for them to start. Is that a misconception, or is that true?
No, I think there's a lot of truth to that. The idea of the person with ADHD is going to have a different perspective on what needs to go into this task that doesn't give them the same level of stimulation and interest. I mean, if you look at the way that we assess for ADHD objectively as a neuropsychologist, the tasks are pretty boring. They're very low stimulation intentionally, because if you create that stimulation, it facilitates your engagement and your initiation. So absolutely, there's a big difference in someone with ADHD's capacity to start that task, begin that drive, and build it up. And fortunately, there's a lot of strategies we have to help set them up for success and make it more manageable.
So how do you assess for if someone, in psychology we call it task initiation, but how do you assess for that? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so one of the big things in neuropsychology is collecting a wide array of sources of data. So if I'm looking at task initiation, I'm never going to just focus on the objective measures that they're completing with me in my office, because number one, they're so contrived to that little tiny setting and window of time. Yeah. And it's also just this tiny little sliver of their life that doesn't really touch on the big picture of who they are as a person. So to me, assessment requires, collaterals, thinking through the perspective of their development from a family side or parent side, a school and educator side, looking at their own self-report and their own description of what it is when they begin a task or what their challenges have felt like to them, trying to connect some of that with questionnaire data to make comparisons to the general population. So ways in which to try to turn their own individual experience to something that we can compare to others. The biggest thing for me, though, is the qualitative elements. So when I'm thinking about task initiation, I want to look at the nature of how someone approaches a task or what they do. One of my favorite for it would be written expression tasks. What happens when they get that essay that they need to start? Did they freeze up when they're trying to think of the idea of what they're going to do, what they're going to write about? Do they struggle when they are beginning a topic sentence and knowing where to transition to from there? If I have them draw an outline for it, what's their approach and how do they break down that project itself? Those qualitative elements, there's never going to be objective data for that. But I still think they're incredibly important for the style of how someone engages.
Yeah, I agree. And you have to see so many young people just crawling out of their skin because you're purposely trying to put them in situations that's hard to start.
Yeah.
But they're in a structured environment, so they have to start it. I'm sure that just that observation alone gives you a lot of great data as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's one thing I like about my job, it's having good rapport with the people that are in my office and trying to help them go through this experience of learning more about how they think and how they solve problems and think about the world. So while certainly there's a squirm element to a lot of these tasks, putting them in the kind of most challenging activity, I think that there's a really good opportunity to say, you know what, this doesn't mean that there's a problem or something wrong. It's an opportunity to learn about a growth edge of your mind and a way to learn more about what skills you can develop based off of this new insight to help these tasks not feel as overwhelming and not feel as anxiety provoking as they currently are.
Yeah, so I've heard you say growth and neuroplasticity several times, which is so great. And that's why I'm having you on here, is that to know that this is not a fixed thing. Let's look at it from a couple different perspectives. The first one is the parent coming into your office saying, my kid's potentially lazy, or associating some character with the procrastination. What are the behavioral strategies or what structures do you help them put in that work?
Yeah. So, number one, I want to acknowledge that as an evaluator, my role largely is to help them build insight and understanding into what leads to the behavior. So some of the things that we talked about before, the idea that there's a brain-based element to this. It's not a character issue. It's not a personality problem. There's reasons why this is a hard thing for them to do. But, when it comes to concrete strategies to support procrastination, two big things I talk about that everyone can do is up your exercise, up your level of physical activity. Yeah. I mean, there is a preponderance of research that shows that increases the overall flow of dopamine in the mind, which means that prefrontal cortex is going to be a little more supercharged and a little more capable to get going, beyond all the other benefits that you obviously get. Mindfulness is a huge one. So working on strategies and practices to get yourself into a place where you're going to be more capable of de-escalating when that anxiety is feeling overwhelming and you have other barriers to beginning activities. Thinking about the task itself and how you're going to approach it. It's really important to break things down into chunks that are more manageable than what I think a lot of people feel like they need to do. The sit down and study for 2 hours. I see a lot of high schoolers that have these incredible amounts of time they spend on homework, and I feel so bad for them because the approach is so inefficient and so just draining that the rubber's burned off on the wheel when they're at their third hour of study. So breaking things down into maybe 10-minute chunks, taking short breaks, ideally with movement involved, ways to break up the flow. Reward yourself after all of those chunks. I think that's a really hard thing for people to feel comfortable with. And reward doesn't have to mean the same thing for every person. Making them a salient good reward, not something that's going to stop you from your flow of work that you're going through.
I love how you included movement and mindfulness, because those are never, like when you Google procrastination strategies, you just don't see those. And those are some of the most important things in the research that we can find. One of the things we've started doing, we've seen a lot of success, is when a student's procrastinating, just sitting there and trying to feel the emotional side of it. Because we usually want to reach for our phones or something, but just sitting in that burning feeling for a second and feeling how overwhelmed we are, a lot of times just letting that go away has really helped our kids.
And that's a mindfulness practice.
100%. 100%. It's really uncomfortable, but it's a lot less uncomfortable than beating yourself up for hours and hours.
Absolutely. Yeah. And think about the level of insight that creates for someone that doesn't naturally do it. That experience of saying, this is what I'm feeling, and this is something that I can then think about and work with.
One of the worst words we can say is should, right? Do you ever hear this from parents where it's like, they're in high school, they should be able to finish a math worksheet. Yeah. Why do I need to reward that?
All the time.
Is that something you hear?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. I think there's, everyone has their own belief system about, what leads to success. And I think a lot of parents have their own path they've gone on and their own barriers they've overpassed. I think what I see a lot of are parents that have had their own personal struggles. I mean, I see a lot of kids with ADHD, and a lot of times there's a genetic component, and there are parents.
The apple does not fall far from the tree, right?
It happens. Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of parents say, this is what I did. This is what works. You should do this, or you should be able to get this done. And similarly, I see parents that have children with different executive function growth edges that are things they didn't experience. And so then there's this idea of well, come on, you just got to start it. You just got to go. You just got to figure it out. And I think that there's the lack of acknowledgement of why there's a challenge doesn't create the opportunity to then work on the skills to build through it.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times, I know I get frustrated sometimes when people close to me procrastinate, because a lot of times I'm frustrated with myself. So that for whatever reason, it brings it out with me.
Yeah.
Or, we have type A parents, right, who've never struggled with this and don't know the internal battle. So for them just to have some concept of how the brain works, I think that's so helpful as well.
Yeah, I really like that you said that, because, we were talking about misconceptions around procrastination. And I think two of the other big ones I see are, it's a fault of the parent or it's a fault of the school. This idea that, a teacher saying, why is the student procrastinating? Their family structure hasn't taught them a better way to approach their work. And similarly, I think that some families feel frustrated when they've tried different strategies and they just want to have the school solve it, or they want a solution to it. So yes, I definitely see some of those unfair blame pieces being edged out.
Yeah. So besides movement, mindfulness, breaking things down, is there anything else that you recommend to students or families to help?
Yeah, I think goal visualization is a big one. So when you actually think in your mind about what it is on a micro level for all these small goals that you're pursuing, you are naturally activating that prefrontal cortex and you're thinking through ways in which you want to achieve that goal and move towards it. So one thing I always talk about is it's not just about breaking things down, it's about being very intentional about what those mini goals are and what you're working towards.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like so much what you're talking about, which is also based in the research, is coming back to the present moment, whether it's coming back to like the goal of the present moment or how we feel in the present moment or mindfulness. It's really trying to come back, because procrastination, usually your mind is somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one challenge with procrastination is that you're stuck in that flickering moment of the now in a way that you feel stuck from starting towards the thing that might fit more with your values of what you want to move towards.
Does structure play into this at all? Because I know just for myself and for students that we work with, it's like if you go to office hours with your professor, well, right away, that 30 minutes is going to save you a ton of time, an hour and a half, 2 hours on the back end by the time you get started, maintain focus. Do you see that in the research as well, as structure works well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you can break down your calendar and your time in a way that naturally breaks into work periods, then it's much easier to break apart your goals and your time flow. So definitely, when you bring up the idea of going to office hours with a professor, that also makes me think about study groups. And one thing I talk about a lot with procrastination is body doubling. Is that a term?
Yeah.
You talk about I would assume,
Very
but
much.
I just really like that idea of kind of creating the cultural side of setting up a standard for how you're going to be working and putting yourself in that situation. I love the athlete analogies with that. In a gym, if you look at a difference between weightlifting when you're around other people and when you're by yourself, there's measurable differences. And the same applies for pretty much any task that humans do.
I know I've talked to you about this before, but the Navy SEAL made famous by Jocko Willink, the discipline equals freedom mindset.
Yes.
I only thought it would land with a certain type of student or a professional. It lands with everybody because we're all after more freedom. Whether
Absolutely.
it's more free time, parents getting off our case, more freedom from anxious thoughts. We're all after this freedom thing. Well, these small disciplines are through it, and it's counterintuitive when you first start. It's like, okay, I should join a yoga class. That's going to open up free time. Or I should go to office hours. That's going to open up free time. That structure has worked tremendously well for me and so many others I know with ADHD.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's usually that initial hesitation around the like, what do you mean doing all of these other things is going to open up more freedom? But I think when you explain the idea of the efficiency of the task itself and the way in which you're able to get things done, as well as the amount of time that your mind occupies that anxiety and tension over the task itself, creating that freedom is so important.
I think being a student with ADHD, we get really defensive. We're getting this constant negative feedback from everybody about this procrastination thing. When you get students in your office, do you hear like the pain in their voice around this? Like, because a lot of times we get defensive. I don't think other people see that. Do you see the pain here?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I think about the pain is from the lived experience of, in a lot of cases, not feeling like you're meeting either personal goals or goals that are expected of you, or you perceive them to be expected by others. And when you compound that time after time, there are traumatic elements to that build. And one of the responses that you build towards trauma is avoidance and defensiveness, trying to get away from that stimulus, the thing that's causing you to feel that way. So, I mean, when you started off this discussion with me, you were talking about that relationship between anxiety and procrastination. And I really see them as so interwoven together. You can't truly address one without addressing the other.
Yeah. So what do you tell, we'll call it a college student. What do you tell that college student who's just beating themselves up? Like, where do they start?
Yeah. I mean, I think the entry point is validation. Recognition that this is not because you're a flawed human being or because you're incapable of achieving these goals or this style of work that you feel like you are supposed to be doing. There are explanations in many cases on a brain-based level for what's occurring, but then also describing that pattern across life and how that's created this ball of twine that's spun up and creating a realistic expectation that this is not going to be something that just changes with me telling you, if you do X, Y, and Z, then everything shifts. It's just not as simple as that. So, to me, it's about having compassion for yourself and working through strategies over time to create different pathways and different styles of learning, but then mixing that in with this exposure element. I mean, what we know about anxiety, the most effective treatment for almost all forms of anxiety is exposure-based. So working on strategies that put you in the spot, not overwhelmingly so, but put you in a place where you're able to challenge yourself and start building those skills.
And that comes back to structure, I would think, for a lot of people, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for talking about the self-compassion, empathy piece, because for our emotional regulation side of this, like that's one of the hardest things to get over is we get caught in this anxiety spiral, which makes it even harder to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of speaks that misnomer about the mind-body connection. Like they're these two separate things that relate differently when it's all the same. So for me, the psychology of the anxiety and the executive functions around initiation and inhibition metacognition, they are the same concept that we're talking about. So the strategies have to relate to both of them, either concurrently or an intervention that does them together.
Got it. We know that getting started, so procrastination, and you've talked a lot about it, it combines a lot with it and overlaps a lot with emotional regulation. Is there anything we can do for this emotional regulation side that also helps us with this procrastination piece?
Yeah. So, I mean, in my opinion, a lot of the interventions that you do to work off procrastination maladaptive behaviors. So the strategies around, breaking things down and goal visualization, mindfulness, all of those ideas, those address the emotion regulation side, and those create a better capacity to keep yourself in a state where you're able to get things done that you're trying to achieve. So, those strategies themselves are going to be their own intervention. I think that it depends on the individual. And I hate that it depends response to questions like that because it doesn't land with any good kind of clear answer. But emotion regulation looks very different for a lot of different people as far as what strategies are going to be helpful for them, which is why I think it's important to be working with folks that recognize their own individual differences. It's why I think that assessment should guide intervention. You should have a good broad understanding of what's going on for the individual and to have that compassion to trial lots of different approaches to see where you end.
Cool. Yeah, I love how you've come back to the basics, because we want to get to the fancy strategies, the latest and greatest app, the timer, but it's sleep, exercise, structure. It's the basics that help us all across the board.
Yeah.
Final question, because I know this will be in the comments somewhere. Okay. Is, what about the person who's like, yeah, I get I should exercise. What if I'm procrastinating with exercise? So I have to bring that up. Is there anything like that would help with that?
Well, so what is exercise for someone, right? You can have a whole scaling down to something you can do. One example is maybe someone says what my exercise needs to be is every 15 minutes I get up and I go for, a walk of X distance. But maybe for someone else, it's I get up and I walk around the room. Maybe for someone else, it's I get up and I stretch for a couple minutes. Maybe someone else, it's simply like I flex and stretch my hands or arms.
Yeah.
I think the key is to start where you are and not to push people into the idea of, the shoulds, right? This is what you should be doing for that exercise break. So I think when we scale down what the expectation is to where someone is, you build that natural success and you strengthen that prefrontal cortex. You strengthen that reward system of I am able to do this and I am able to maybe take a half step forward and building in that way.
Yeah, coming from Tiny Habits, Stanford behavioral research, it's the people who did one push-up a day were more likely to get in shape long-term than people who were going to crush it the first day. It's breaking it down, like you said, building this habit and letting that habit grow. And then when we talked to your colleague, Dr. Powell, she talked about before the behavior happens, looking at what we call the antecedent, what happens right before the behavior. So putting your running shoes next to the door, or like decreasing the amount of effort it takes to accomplish the behavior, we've seen a lot as well.
Absolutely. Set up the context for success.
Yeah.
Create the things before the issue occurs so that you have the tools and coping strategies available so that you can manage it.
Awesome. Zach, thank you so much for taking the time. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
So I'm in practice at New Peaks Neuropsychology. Our website, newpeaksneuropsych.com, has a lot of information about myself and my colleagues there. Yeah, I think that's probably the best place.
Thank you so much for doing. Thanks for breaking that down for us.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Executive Function for All podcast. If today's episode brought you any value, please rate us 5 stars and share it with someone who may benefit. And remember, every small step you take builds towards your success. For resources and guidance, visit untappedlearning.com. Keep growing, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.